Hello, everyone, and welcome to day three of the Future of Healing event. Three workshops over 3 days presented by the Centre for Healing. My name is Ryan Hassan. For those who don't know already, I'm co-founder at the Centre for Healing and co-creator of our somatic modality embodied processing. And today I'm joined, my co-host is Matt Kay, my fellow co-creator of EP. Matt, how are you today?
Thanks. Hey, everyone.
And really excited about today's topic. The exploration of anger, particularly suppressed anger, is one that I would think, in the years that we've been running embodied processing in the student community, we've had more questions than any other around the emotion of anger and how to properly access that, how to not have ourselves step in and shut down that on a nervous system level. And so we have had many, many discussions over the years about this topic because it is very, very interesting. So what I'm going to do in a moment, I'm just going to let a few more people in who are in the waiting room, is I'm going to start sharing my screen. We have some slides to go through. Like I said before we pressed record, but to anyone watching the replay as well, please feel free, like take notes. I'm a note taker in these type of classes, but also screenshotting a lot of the stuff that we pull up can be really, really helpful as well. So let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen there, Matt?
Yeah, mate, I can.
All right. I'm just going to present here. All right, let's start off by getting really, really basic and talking about what actually anger is. Anger is necessary emotional feedback. All emotions that we have as human beings are very, very necessary. Even though there's some, and we're probably conditioned at a young age, that some emotions are bad and some are good, that's simply not the truth. They are all there to give us feedback on this journey of being a human being, and anger is no different to any other. The purpose of anger is for setting and respecting boundaries of ourselves. So when someone or something oversteps a boundary, we use the emotion of anger to let that situation or that person know that that boundary has been breached. Anger is a sympathetic emotion. So if we think about things from the nervous system point of view, we have a parasympathetic branch and a sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Anger is very much a sympathetic emotion, meaning it's very mobilizing. There's a lot of energy in anger. Anger wants to, at its core, take action. There's a lot of energy and juice behind it. And this is what we're going to get into, I guess, in the crux of this talk. And Matt, you would maybe want to talk about this, but anger is very much linked to our personal power and our zest for life. One thing that I found with the vast majority of clients that I've seen over the years is that when they have a lot of suppressed and undealt with anger, they come into session feeling in a very much a disempowered state as a human being. And as they go through anger and go through the process of working through and integrating, they start to regain that personal power. Would you agree?
Yes, definitely. Anger it's something that our culture has a, very dysfunctional relationship to, and it's kind of understandable because if you look at like lots of terrible things that happen, they can be driven by anger, but they're not driven by the energy of anger itself, but they're driven by anger when it's distorted, when it's not integrated, when it's in a kind of reactive state, like there's um anger itself, it's like without anger, we end up being kind of like doormats, our ability to say no to injustice, our ability to set boundaries, our ability to feel firm and stable within ourselves is diminished. And when we're unable to feel anger and when anger is repressed, there's no way of fully feeling safe within ourselves. But our ability to feel anger, our ability to set boundaries and say no relationally, um, is a essential part of feeling safe in relationship. Like think about it. If we can't say no to toxic behavior or abusive behavior, if we can't stand in our own two shoes and say no, like back off and feel that anger and allow ourselves to feel that, how are we ever going to feel safe whilst relating to other people? Well, we're not, because a part of us is always going to be on hyper alert, in hyper vigilance, waiting for the next attack, waiting for the next comment, shaming comment, or the next abuse, or whatever it is. And so we're always going to end up being anxious, and on alert whilst relating to others. And so, when we start to learn to allow anger, it can be like a whole well opens up. I remember when I first started to feel my anger, I had and we'll get into coupling dynamics and stuff a bit later, but I had terror, like, start coming through first. It was like I'm gonna kill someone, I was petrified of my own anger, because there was years and years of it repressed, and like a dam had broken open and it started to come to the surface. But as I learnt to start to allow it, I started to feel it like as my inner strength, like my masculinity. And I don't mean masculine as in male, but all all genders have masculine and feminine traits. And it was that sense of like um personal power and zest, like exactly what it says there, and that ability to actually say no. And I realized I'd never said no in my life in an empowered way. It had always came from a sense of reactivity to a deep sense of helplessness. And so working with anger has really been essential. And there's a few other modalities, that I got trained in that their approach was to, because anger can really often be a secondary emotion, a protective emotion that's protecting a deeper vulnerability and wound. And their approach was, um, and another EP trainer said they recently did a training as well where they said this is you don't work with the anger, you just go to the primary emotion underneath. But anger has a very deep lesson in it, like if we can't allow ourselves to feel anger, we're going to be hugely limiting um, the degree to which we can actually embody our own personal power.
Yeah, so true. And just the bottom top point before we move on is, suppressed anger can just lead to many negative health outcomes. I've seen clients with suppressed anger that's led to feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, a lot of reactivity, addictions, alcoholism, compulsive behaviors, all of the above, and actually, there are a lot of links with suppressed anger and physical issues as well. And I know that not with all clients that have had sort of chronic pain or physical issues, but a lot of them have seen a reduction in symptoms when working with anger because it seems when anger is internalized for long enough, it starts to morph into resentment. And resentment is just a very, very toxic state, for our body and our mind. I heard in a book many, many years ago, it's like it was about addictions actually. And it said, if you have the choice between guilt and resentment, choose guilt every time because resentment is soul suicide. And soul suicide is a pretty strong term, but it's kind of an idea of how toxic resentment can be for our system. And just some of society's perceptions. So I know we have associations with any word and especially any emotion. And a lot of the associations most people have when we talk about anger is extremely negative and distorted, And that's because that's mainly what we see. Because so much of society has issues with suppressed and repressed anger growing up, whether it be in our own family dynamics or we see it on television or the news, what we tend to see is a very destructive form of anger. We learn normally early on when we're a kid, normally when we've seen one of our parents, possibly our dad, show destructive forms of anger, that it's an emotion to be feared. We should be scared of it. It's also one that we often get abandoned and not accepted in when we're a kid. We are programmed from an early age, if we're having a tantrum or displaying anger in some way that we are wrong. A lot of people will then, put a kid in timeout, which means literally distance yourself from the family and your source of survival until you can not be in this emotional state anymore. So you can see how when we're a kid, we really learn this tool of suppression because it helps maintain attachment in those early family dynamics. And so, whatever emotional states we are not accepted in as a child are the emotional states that we will not accept ourselves in as an adult. So that's why a lot of people, when they start to access or work with their anger, it's deemed by their system not to be safe because there's so many beliefs and conditioning tied up around being abandoned in that emotion when we were a kid.
And then,
Um,
anger can be coupled with that aloneness as well, like the anger and disconnection kind of can be joined together, and like it's a thing, something that is completely foreign and that I'd never experienced before. And my system can still revert back to that, but it's like being angry and in conflict with someone with without withdrawing connection or without connection being withdrawn. Like that ability to stay connected whilst being angry at someone. For me, like growing up, it's like anger meant the end of love. There was no more connection. It's like if my parents were angry at me, there was a deep sense of aloneness and disconnection that would come up. But that ability to remain present and connected whilst we're feeling anger. And so, our society, it has all these perceptions of anger, like for good reason, but it comes back to that point. There's a difference between conscious presence whilst experiencing anger versus kind of going unconscious and the anger just acting itself out, hijacking the nervous system. And the difference there is, our window of tolerance and our nervous system's capacity to be present and experience something in the moment. It's like, if I say my kids do something that crosses my boundary and I have that very instinctual and natural anger response move through my system. It's like in that moment, what often happens is we go kind of unconscious and we get flooded and the anger just acts itself out, kind of autopilot, the ship steering itself. But in that moment, to be able to pause, become present, and feel the anger all through the body, maybe my hands will start shaking and I can feel like my heart beating and I get heat coursing through my body and the tingling and aliveness. There's a way of, there's a fine line between, um, we're neither acting it out nor repressing it in that moment. And that ability to stay present with it, to notice our breathing, to stay within that felt sense, it transforms the anger to the point where it's not even really anger anymore. It's more like a ferocious presence, and you look at some different people throughout history who really had that integrated anger, that immovability. Someone like, say, Martin Luther King, where their no just meant no. They weren't reactive, in the sense that, th- what we mostly think of as anger, but there was a firm, immovable presence, like emanating almost from the belly center. And so anger can be transformed into a very powerful and positive state of being that can bring about great shifts in society as long as it's channeled and it's felt consciously, and as long as we're able have that ability to stay present to it. But it's when we're unconscious and reactive and anger takes over and we're kind of just reenacting patterns of rage, then all these perceptions are actually valid. They all have a truth to them. It is unpredictable. Like not even the person has control over anymore. It can be destructive. It can be scary. All of those sort of things. And so it's more about our capacity to experience anger versus our capacity to get hijacked by it.
Yeah, beautiful. So I was just going through the chats, a lot of people sharing about their some physical or health issues and anger, which is really, really cool. Um, Somebody just asked a name of a book I mentioned the other day. It's called Healing Back Pain by Dr. John Sarno. And it's an eye-opening book. I don't fully agree with it because he says that 100% of back pain can be linked to repressed anger. I'm not that black and white about it, but I've certainly seen it in many instances with that. And also somebody just asked about denying feelings of anger impacting our cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. Yeah, I mean, if we have anger unresolved and bubbling under the surface, 24/7, then that's a sympathetic response happening 24/7 where those chemicals or those hormones are running in the system. So it makes sense if the body is in a very stressed state ongoing, because our body is designed to come in and out of sympathetic response. It's not that we're not meant to have sympathetic response. We're meant to in the right context in relation to what we deem as a physical or psychological threat, but we ideally come in and out of it. But a lot of people who have this repressed and suppressed anger have that sympathetic system on to a degree all the time. And, that can show up in, doing, like very yang energy, like staying busy all the time or looking after other people's needs whilst neglecting our own. A lot of these sort of people pleasing and staying busy symptoms are a sign or symptom of repressed anger. So just to wrap that up, society has really seen the unhealthy version of anger, which is suppression or overexpression. Suppression probably for the most amount of people, but then we do get a subset of people who have anger at the surface all the time and are ready to throw that at someone else at any opportunity.
That's really common too, and it's often swings between the two for people. Like they repress, 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 and then explode. And repress, 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 and then explode. That's a very common pattern. It's like a pressure cooker, repressing anger, it's a self-perpetuating cycle because when they explode, they go into shame spirals. Like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? Look what I just did. And it makes them even more terrified and ashamed of their anger. So then they go more into repression again and then explode. The same thing happens again. So it's self-affirming, self-perpetuating in that sense because the very cycle and pattern itself exacerbates that fear and shame of anger, which then exacerbates the repression, which then exacerbates the explosion.
Yeah, it's a cycle that'll keep continuing unless it's addressed. And I think a lot of people that come in for work and to get help, they're in that kind of explosion when the pressure cooker's gotten too high in pressure. And I've had many clients reach out and go, "Yeah, I've just started becoming really angry the last couple of weeks, and I don't know what's caused it." And generally, without fail, it's not situational. Very, on rare occasions it is, but most of the time it's a build-up of many, many years, sometimes decades of suppressed anger, which now the body and the psyche just cannot contain anymore.
And what can happen as well, just as another kind of response to that, is anger gets so repressed that the person goes into shutdown, their system goes into collapse, and so then can show up as like just deep depressive states, no motivation, no will, the system's just gone into a collapse state.
Yeah. For sure. And so we're just going to talk about coupling dynamics now, because as Matt said at the start, anger can be really tied in with a lot of other emotions or nervous system states. And oftentimes, when people are coming in and doing an embodied processing session, part of the work early on is one of discernment, because they come in and it could be a situation in their life now, a memory from the past, a pattern that, they know they have. And it's made up of, obviously images and thoughts and stories and beliefs, but also a mesh of sensations and emotions in the body. And part of the process, it's like a big, ball of twine made up of many different bits of string. And it's like the process of discernment is starting to pull those threads apart and work out, okay, this is our fawning response. And then we've got sadness and hurt over here. Oh, this bit is the actual anger here. And once we go through that discerning process, we can start to actually work with the anger directly and not so much all of the things that it's coupled with. And so, we can have anger overcoupled with fear. So if our anger, like I spoke about earlier, wasn't accepted when we were younger, we might feel safe to allow anger to come up to, let's say, if we're doing a scale of 0 to 10, 4, but anything beyond that is deemed as not safe by the nervous system. So we automatically, Matt said he had terror step in when he started exploring it. Fear or terror steps in and we shut that anger down. It becomes unsafe and we get very, very scared. We can have just a complete shutdown response. I've had clients start to go into their anger and all of a sudden their whole body and nervous system will collapse and they'll start to dissociate because once again, anger was not deemed safe by the body and exploring that, and I love your thoughts here, Matt, because you use the analogy of can be like turning a tap on and off. And in a client practitioner context, that could be a great way for a client to get more comfortable with the sensations of anger.
Yeah, little bits, because if what can happen is our threat response, is scan like when someone's traumatized, we have a radar, we're constantly scanning our environment. Where is the threat? It's like because our nervous system went into survival and never properly came out. because of our environment, because of a situation, whatever it is, our relationship, relational dynamics, etc. So we develop this kind of hyper vigilant radar, always scanning, where's the threat? That scanning, that radar system can also is also scanning our inner environment. And so as we're growing up, and I think it happens, from a parent's inability to discern or convey the difference between the feeling and the behavior, because it's like we can say all feelings are welcome, but that doesn't mean all behaviors are welcome. Like if a child's hitting us, biting us, like swearing at us, saying all this stuff, like that behavior is not okay relationally. And if we kind of say, oh, that's welcome, like they're going to be extremely unsocialized, and have a lot of difficulty throughout their lives. And so I think parents, need to learn, to empathize and validate the emotion whilst discerning the behavior, as well. And usually, like we don't discern, when we're telling a child off, we don't discern their behavior from who they are. It's like, well, that behavior's not not okay. And it gets experienced by the child because of lack of explaining and often the parents are in overwhelm as well. It gets experienced as I'm not okay. And so then when anger arises, in our childhood and we get shut down for it, like sent to our room, cracked it out, whatever, without any context, that radar system starts honing in on the anger. So then anger itself becomes the threat because every time anger comes up, it threatens the attachment to my parents. And when my attachment's threatened, I feel disconnected, I feel alone, and so then that gets linked to our survival drive. So anger becomes a threat to our survival because as children, we need our parents to survive. Without them, we would die. And so the attachment to the parents is a survival need. And when anger threatens that attachment, anger becomes the potential threat of death. And so when anger arises, our nervous system automatically, and sometimes this can happen so unconsciously and so automatically, after 30 years of anger repression, it can kind of be like to the point where it doesn't even arise. The system has become so efficient at repressing it that it's just doesn't arise at all. And it might come up a little bit, and then boom, it's shut straight back down. And so there's a difference between someone's kind of mind saying, "Oh yeah, I'm ready to feel my anger," versus their nervous system capacity to actually feel it. It's why in trauma work, too much too soon is never helpful, ever. Like it's kind of the opposite of what the nervous system needs. We might feel, a sense of self might feel, I'm ready to work through all my anger, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't mean our nervous system has the capacity to do that yet. And so you talk about the tap analogy. It's like we turn on the tap a little bit and we allow a little bit of it and then we turn it off. And then we turn it on a bit more and allow a little bit of it and turn it off again. And so over time, that grows our window of tolerance and our nervous system capacity because it shows our nervous system and our body that anger is actually safe to feel and I can contain it and nothing bad's going to happen because that radar has to be turned off and that radar isn't just happening in our mind, it's a full body experience. Our whole system is hypervigilant and learnt to perceive anger as a threat. And so it's something that, less is more often when working with this kind of stuff. We feel a bit and then we turn it off and we feel a bit more and we turn it off. And over time, our capacity to stay present to and experience anger in the way that I was explaining earlier, viscerally, to stay present to it, that our capacity to do that grows and grows over time, and which starts to soften that threat response and anger over time starts to feel more and more safe to feel.
Yeah, really well explained, Matt. And this is just a bit of a visual representation of those coupling dynamics where, anger can be overcoupled with a shutdown or a fear or a fight response, but also anger can overcouple sadness or hurt. And, that's a really common one as well, where we have a very tender spot of something that we've been through that brings up a lot of sadness or will really hurt. And as soon as we start to touch on that, and it can happen in session, then anger will just come up immediately just to say, hey, let me take care of this. We're not going to go there. And that's essentially a protector part becoming active to try and protect a very tender, wounded child normally. Um, but also, yeah, that's why, one of the things in a practitioner client relationship is so important that when we have a new client and we're exploring anger, first of all, we have the orientation that all is welcome here, so that the client then isn't going to feel judged or unaccepted in any of the emotions they were most likely unaccepted in when they were younger. And then we explore without any sort of attachment, and we can explore their felt sense of anger, what it feels like in their body, like I always, when a client, when I'm first working with them and they say, I think I'm angry, I'll say, well, how do you know? And it's like, wow, I get this sort of knot in my belly and, some heat across here and my hands want to clench. And then as we explore that, if they have that shutdown overcoupling dynamic, then we'll notice maybe at a 4 out of 10, it shuts down. And we note that, we explore that, we experience that. And we might come back to a resource, which is a place of safety we've created. And then which is turning the tap off in Matt's analogy, and then turning the tap on, we might dip back into that anger and see if we can get to a 4 or 5 because we're giving contrary evidence. The nervous system and the body and the subconscious go, any more anger than this, then I'm going to be in trouble. This is going to be a bad situation for me. But when they go to that edge, the edge of their window of tolerance, and realize they're not being judged, they're still accepted in this relational dynamic with the practitioner, it gives them different evidence to what their programming was. And so that's how we start to grow in our capacity to be with sensation, by being in the compassionate presence of another human being who's ideally also done a fair bit of work on their own anger. Because, and we're never going to be perfect as a practitioner, but if I haven't done a lot of work around my anger, then seeing anger in a client is sometimes going to then dysregulate me. And now, a term that we use in EP is co-regulation. Ideally, we're co-regulating in a very positive way, but all of a sudden now we're just dysregulating in that instance.
And it's, like the more we start to feel safe with our own anger, the more we feel safe working with the client's anger as well. I heard Gabor Mate once say the best therapists aren't the ones that have studied a whole bunch, but the ones who have done their own work, and that's definitely been my experience when working with people, the ones who have traversed their own landscape and looked at their own developmental wounds and learned to experience whatever it is, whatever emotion it is, in the same way I was describing experiencing anger, then they can actually guide you to do it. It's like I say, if you want to learn basketball, you don't go to someone who's read a whole bunch of books about basketball. You want to go to Michael Jordan, like someone who played basketball, much more than someone who's read a lot about it. And it's the same sort of thing. And this is why, in EP, it's a huge part of the course is about doing our own work. We emphasize that. But it's I just want to point out, because a lot of different therapies are kind of like primal therapies and screaming and rage, letting out the rage by screaming and bashing into a pillow and all that sort of stuff. Like that can be helpful when our system is in like a global activation, when there's so much there that it's basically impossible to stay present to. Some of it has to be kind of discharge. In EP, we call it global high intensity activation, which is a term from somatic experiencing. But those those kind of practices, unless we're just kind of letting out some of the steam so we then can be present and regulate the anger, don't actually regulate anger, and they don't transform anger. What they do is bypass all of the things that we're talking about. And so we call those a kind of in EP we call them a cathartic spew, where the system is so full with a certain emotion, whether it be anger, terror, etc., that we just kind of spew it out. And without presence and awareness to that actual release, nothing integrates, because what can happen is, it's like I used to do a lot of breath work, and breath work is amazing, but there are some holes in the industry and the way it's taught. It's like we're taught to just we used to be taught to just breathe through whatever comes up, just keep breathing and let loose, let it all come up. But it was only in hindsight that I realized, like during those sessions, I was having all these cathartic spews, but I wasn't in my body, you know, I was dissociated. I wasn't aware of the sensations. And so what ended up happening is I was reenacting certain trauma patterns. Nothing was actually integrated because I hadn't done the groundwork. I didn't have the capacity to actually be in my body when it was happening. I didn't have the capacity to feel through the sensations. And, you know, so the ability to stay present and conscious and be aware of the subtleties of sensations, what's happening in my shoulders, in my hips, you know, in my belly, in my jaw, and being able to feel through each little nook and cranny of the anger and be completely present to it. It transforms the anger in a completely different way, you know, where it's not just kind of spewing it out of your system, but it's kind of like alchemy. You know, our presence is causes this alchemical process with the anger that integrates it kind of back into our being, you know. And so it's a really important kind of thing to kind of grasp. And usually we get there through trial and error, you know, and it's an experiential understanding, you know. It's like when I've worked with a lot of people who've, you know, done years of work on their anger and their grief and blah, blah, blah. But then, you know, they'll have a moment where it's like, oh, wow, this is what it means to be fully present and in my anger. And it's a completely different experience to anything they had of experienced before. And then I understand what you're talking about now because I experienced it.
Yeah. And so just some of the signs of integrated anger, like it's good to know like where we're headed or where a client's headed if we're working with them, because this process can be not all sunshine and rainbows, as with any other emotion that we're working through. A lot of you on this call will know healing's not so much linear. It's a process where, normally when we first start exploring an emotion like anger, we feel like we're getting worse because now we're becoming conscious of all the unconscious times that we suppress our own anger and neglect our own needs and abandon ourselves. So we become aware of that, and then we make some strides where we feel like we're fully healed and we're nearly at the end of the road to enlightenment, and then we come back to, our level. It can be a bit of a messy journey, but what we're moving towards along the way is what we've spoken about: personal power. Our no means no. We are able to say no, and we don't have to yell and scream no. We just say no, and it has so much weight behind it. I always tell people there's a movie, V for Vendetta, and right near the end, Natalie Portman's got her hand on a thing to send a train of explosives. Anyway, and she's held at gunpoint. And so, if anyone wants to watch that movie at the end, she gives the perfect example of an empowered and integrated no at the end of that movie. Also, our yes now means something. When we say yes to everything, our yes doesn't have any weight, doesn't mean anything. But if we're now able to say no, our yes actually means something, because when we say yes to something, it's coming from inspiration, it's coming from our heart, and it's coming from a place of not abandoning ourselves. More energy is freed up, and we have that suppressed anger. The anger itself, sort of under the surface or under the hood, is chewing up energy in terms of a sympathetic response. It also takes energy to keep it suppressed. Like we're unconsciously holding it down there 24/7. So both of those things are using up a lot of our energy. So a lot of energy can get freed up as we start to metabolize the anger that we've held on to throughout our life. We can stand in our own two shoes. We know who we are. We know we're a unique human being on this planet, and that's perfectly fine to be that unique expression. Less resentment. I spoke at the start about how toxic resentment can be. So removing that from our system, we should be doing a heavy metals detox and all that kind of thing. Let's do a resentment detox as well. It's good for us. And we can start to take the keys to our life back. We can stop inherently being angry, because resentment, it sucks because we tend to abandon ourselves because of suppressed anger, mostly with the people we care about the most. Could be our partner, could be our friends, could be family members. And then over time, that turns into resentment to the people that we love the most in this world. And that's why it becomes even more toxic than what I spoke about before.
Someone's just asked if we think EFT tapping is a tool that helps integrate the emotions. Like as I said with breath work, like it can be absolutely amazing. Like I'm a huge fan of tapping. It just depends how it's used by the practitioner. So we're actually um, launching in July a somatic version of EFT and a somatic version of breath work as well. Just to fill those kind of gaps that I spoke about. But you know, if it's used with presence and somatic awareness, that's the key factor. because we can be tapping, but just be completely in our mind with no body awareness, dissociated from the felt sense of the issue. And so then we can have a cognitive shift, but it doesn't integrate into the body. And so but if it's used with that presence and awareness and embodiment, I've had huge shifts from tapping, many years ago.
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, So triggers we can work with. So if we want to start exploring anger, how can we, get in touch with it? And there's a few ways. They're pretty broad categories, but oftentimes someone's anger that scares us, it could be our partner, our boss, our co-worker, or something like that. Or we could think back to our childhood and those anger that scared us when we were younger, a person or situation in our life. Also, our relationship, we have a relationship to the anger in others. We also have a relationship with the anger within ourselves and displaying it. And these are two different things. So they can both be explored and used as triggers, whether we're doing an exploration ourselves or in session. And really just getting to know that emotion, the experience of anger yourself. Like, what does anger actually feel like with you in the body? And one thing that we do, and Ben touched on this last night, is, we let stories happen because destructive anger has a story. It's like, I'm angry and this is the reason. It's their fault. I went through this and I shouldn't have. This is going to happen in the future. There's stories attached to it. And we let the stories speak in EP, but we let them speak until they've had enough to say. And so then we're just left with the sensations and the experience of anger. And invariably, when people start to do that, when the stories start to fall away and they feel anger, they can feel that their personal power is in there somewhere. It's just been distorted with all the stories and narratives that we've created about it. And that's a beautiful place to work with anger and really any other emotion as well.
It's like, for an example, if someone's in an abusive relationship that they can't leave and stuck in kind of chronic fawning, or my mum calls it the please disease, um, or in a situation where it's like they have no motivation to leave, they're just kind of stuck. Getting someone in touch with their anger, because if you think about it, if you actually experience your anger around the abuse that you're suffering or the pain that a certain person's causing you, if you actually let yourself experience that rage, that's going to give you the power, the personal power and motivation to say no or leave. It's only through that anger. And so people in that situation who are stuck in kind of fawning patterns and nice guys and good girls, stuck in those kind of personality traits, like working with their anger can really help bring that power back online, so they can start to re-inhabit themselves, their own values, their own needs.
Yeah. And just want to go through some of the regulation techniques here, Matt, because, anger being more of a sympathetic emotion can require a little bit more movement and things when working with it. I don't know if any of you on this call have, tried to meditate and sit still when you're really, really angry. It's really hard. And the mind tends to go absolutely nuts in those moments because something in the physiology wants to move. And we're just like, no, I'm sitting on my cushion and I'm going to wait until this anger stops. And we tend to stand up more frustrated than when we sat down.
Yeah, that can end up being like a repression strategy. So, like trying to calm our anger, can often just be another way that we disguise repressing it. Sometimes anger needs to be allowed. Sky hop down. Um, anger needs to be allowed. So if we're angry, the meditation doesn't have to just be sitting with our eyes closed trying to rest in a state of pure calm. Meditation, like exactly the way I was describing how to experience anger, is a form of meditation, present moment experiencing, present moment awareness. And so, broadening our meditation practice to include movement, to include the ability to stay present to different emotions and let them move through rather than trying to repress them or change the state to get to a different state, learning to be present to what is. And so, letting the anger express itself, if, because often what we do is we self-censor, and all of us do that. Like say with clients, like have anger and they'll be like, oh, I can't think that about mum. Like she did the best she could. She was a single mum, went through trauma, etc., etc. Like that narrative can just be a form of self-censoring. And so helping ourselves or our client get in touch with what the emotion wants to say rather than what their cognitive mind thinks about it. And it might be true and rational. There might be a lot of truth to that, that what mum went through, she did her best, etc. But what I explain is the anger itself doesn't care. It's irrational. It's an irrational part of ourselves. So we can't rationalize ourselves out of an irrational response. And so if the anger could speak, if this part of you could come out and we can, include communicating with it at this point, like what would you say if there was no self-censoring? If you just kind of let the chains off the beast, and we can do that bit by bit. What if you just let the anger up a little bit and let it say or do whatever it wants for 5 seconds? Now, another strategy is I get clients to put the anger at a distance, maybe all the way to like the middle of the Pacific Ocean and turn it into a symbol. Maybe it's a gorilla or a shark or a T-Rex or something, and let it do whatever it wants to do and you watch it. So having that distance can create a bit of safety, where they can actually experience it. And then, we slowly start to come in and as we communicate with it, we can ask inquiry questions like, what is it that you needed that you didn't get? What are you really angry about? And if there's coupling dynamics, we can ask, well, if there's fear of feeling the anger, what's the worst that we think would happen if we let this anger up? For me, it was like, I'll kill someone, petrified if I let this anger up, like it would do a lot of damage. So we can start to inquire into it and look at it from all different angles. And as for the actual raw felt sensations, because as we're inquiring, we're kind of learning to be present to it. And then, in the physical, somatic, felt sense, like breathing in, opening our hands, breathing out, squeezing. And if we can feel our body wants to shake, we can kind of just start to open to that in little bits. And if at any point it feels too much, we can step back out, ground, feel our feet on the ground, come back to resource. If we're yelling, I often like when if a client has that urge to kind of scream, I often get them to really slow it down rather than just scream because it's kind of like, if imagine you're having a fight with your partner and you're screaming, you're just kind of letting the anger out. Like that's not healing, and we can do the same thing in session where we just kind of scream and go unconscious and let it out. Like that's what I call reenacting anger. So I often get them to slow it right down and be really conscious and present as they let that yelling out or that roar out. And that's the difference. Conscious presence, embodiment, being associated and experiencing it fully. Stomping, writing, letting the pen, letting the anger kind of say what it needs to say by writing it out, without that self-censoring mind kind of repressing it. Putting your hands up against the wall, because it can be helpful to have some resistance. If there's a safe person, you can kind of interlock hands like that and breathe in. I often say breathe in the anger, and then on the out breath, push, and feel it coming through your arms. Feel those sensations directly. Noticing resistances, different ways that we repress it, as often clients will start to do some of these practices and then they'll have a part come up and just say, I've kind of gone limp, like it doesn't feel safe to feel, so then we come back to just really titrating little bits. And working with a practitioner, it's like we can do these practices on our own, but there's nothing like having an empathic witness, an empathic other to witness us do it and to help guide us through our process. Someone who's been there and done the work themselves and knows the territory is invaluable.
So true. And just with the, inquiring into the part as well, I put up on day one on the shame class with Ben, there was a whole slide of inquiry questions when we were talking about deconstructing shame. You can go back and watch the replay and screenshot. You could use the exact same set of questions when inquiring into anger as well, which is, can I see this as a part? Can I witness this part? If this part could express itself, what would it say? What does this part believe about the world? What does this part believe about me? There's a whole, there's about 15 or so of them on there. So if you want to go back and have a look at day one and screenshot that, the same applies to anger here. And so, what this might look like in a session of exploring anger, this is the embodied processing flowchart of how we run a session, all of the elements of it broken down into a nice little A4 bit of paper. But basically, exploring anger, we obviously start off an EP session by finding resource, and we have different methods of that. Three of them are up there now. We have about six in the training now, and that is finding some sort of sense and safety in somebody's felt sense. And there's different ways of doing that. If we can't find safety and support, at least neutrality or a lack of activation is an island that we can come back to as we're exploring parts of the body and the psyche. We might then take an instance. I'm just trying to think of an example here with anger. I had one client, apologies to my EP practitioners on this call because I brought up this story on Monday's support call. But I had a client who her father left the family, abandoned them when she was 4, came back into their life when she was a teenager, and she had a relationship with him now and worked for him part time. She came to see me because she was having some issues going on, and I noticed that she didn't want to talk about dad too much. Yet, whenever we touched on it, I could see, paying attention to her physiology, that there was something going on there. So I asked if it's okay if we explore the relationship and the dynamic with dad. She told me that we didn't need to because it was all fine. She wrote a forgiveness letter 5 years ago with a life coach and it was all dealt with. I just said, okay, well, if it is dealt with, then let's explore, nothing going on. So she actually had a mild, I guess, overcoupling of anger, a dissociation of wanting to just not look at it and look away. And we had to sort of work through that. It's like having you've got an immaculately clean house, yet one room is an absolute mess, hasn't been cleaned for years, and you just keep the door shut. Whenever someone comes around to open the door, you're like, just keep it shut. It's fine in there. It's no problem. So we had to work through that. And I go to a place where she was open to saying, okay, I won't, I'll let the dissociation step aside and we'll explore this dynamic. And whenever we went to inquire into him, into the body, her felt sense, she would get a really strong no, a very angry no. And so we had that anger dynamic. So if we're looking at the flow chart here, we started exploring the trigger, finding its origins, and we we're working through the images and sensations that she was having. And as we were working just with the no, just with the resistance to exploring the dynamic, once we started to process that, she said, "Oh, I can see this part is just a part of me." And I said, "What's the purpose of this part?" And she said, "It's to protect me." And I said, "Protect you from what?" And she said, "Protect me from this." And she broke down and cried, and we processed sadness and hurt for probably the next 20 minutes, to be honest. And so she had this bodyguard of anger, which was being slightly dissociated from, and underneath the anger was a huge amount of sadness and hurt around the abandonment, of one of her parents, of her caregivers. And so, oftentimes a session can look like we may start off by working with anger, finding its origins, and we process, go through the flow chart here, and we might have to work through a fight or a flight response. And then we have to go all the way back up and work with what's underneath, which can be that sadness or hurt or something under there. Any examples you have, Matt, when looking at the flow chart?
Um, Myself, I can go a bit more deeper into that. So, when I was working with anger, my own rage, it was many years ago. First, I was in a situation where I really wanted to say no, but my whole body was going into terror, around saying no. I was really angry about it, but I wasn't experiencing the anger. What I was experiencing was terror. And as I kind of stayed present to it, I remember it being in my belly. And by that point, I'd developed a lot of capacity and safe inner resources. And I used to stand in a kind of qigong position with my legs slightly bent and feel my feet on the ground. And I used to use my breath as another resource, as a way of staying present, and also a divine symbol at the time, which I'd hold in mind, and kind of ask to come and help contain the space. And so I remember starting to feel through that terror, and kind of moving in and out of it bit by bit, and staying with it and just asking a few inquiry questions. So I was utilizing the pendulation, the cohabitation, feeling the breath and the terror at the same time, all of these kind of things. And as I just stayed present to that terror, it kind of just naturally, that's all I had to do was learn to stay present to it, uncoupled itself and discharged. And then rage was underneath it, like huge rage. And as I started to feel that rage, like more layers of terror would come through. Um, and terror that I was going to kill someone, that, and memories of my childhood when I would have, toddler tantrums and all that sort of stuff, and how it was met, and terrors of being abandoned. And so there was all these little complexities, that were coming up, and I was only able to see them because of that ability to stay really present to the bodily sensations. So it wasn't something I was thinking about. It's almost like the thoughts were coming out of the sensations, and the memories that were just kind of bubbling up out of it. And as that terror kind of complete, it's like, if you come down to the finding resolution and completion, like the answer was no. And so I came back up. And then the next process was to discern the emotion and sensation again. And it was rage, underneath that terror. And so it's kind of like I went through all of these many, many times. And then the rage, starting to come up, and all these insights coming from the rage, that ability to stay present, the sense of power in it, um, that all slowly started to integrate. Even now, like years later, like it's just a constant refinement process. It doesn't hit an end point where it's like, yep, my anger is perfectly integrated in all situations. Like, no, like I'd be lying if I said that. It's more like a constant refinement, like evolution, it always is refining itself. And then as the rage moved through, that ability to then discern what was underneath the rage, also the layers of shame would really come through, like being really ashamed that I could feel this way, like that I have that potential of, fight, like instinctual energies that could kill, really like shameful beliefs around that. Spiritual beliefs, like it's not spiritual to kind of feel this way, and me seeing the falsehood of all these beliefs and how they're just ways to repress it. And then coming back, as the anger, moved through, grief and vulnerability underneath it, feelings of really deep deficiency, and really more vulnerable layers of emotions. And so, it took a long time to kind of cycle through all these things. Um, but, and, then coming down, finding resolution and completion, eventually it's like, like that out breath, like you've gone through fear, your body's shaken, and then you've gone through rage, and then you've had a big cry, and it's like, something just softens. And that's kind of like going through the trauma response cycle, completing the fight, flight, freeze response, and then softening back into I'm safe and it's over now. So that's, my experience, and it mirrors a lot of my clients' experience also, with different details, but theme the same.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. And just yeah, just to reiterate, like especially with a new client coming in, just being able to have that sense of rapport and presence with them, have them, we spoke about it in the other classes as well, but people come in for this work and we're always trying to wear a mask and hold something back and trying to be someone different. If we can create a space for our clients where all of them is welcome here and they feel free and safe to be able to take off those masks with us, we are in such a better position to work with anger, with grief, with sadness, with hurt, with fear, all of it. So that's sort of, you've heard probably, Matt say presence, a dozen times on this call. There's a reason for that. It's because before any of the frameworks and a modality and all that even make sense of using, we have to be present and attuned to our client because they can pick up on that and they can sense that, if not consciously, unconsciously. And it's so important when doing this type of work. So we always bring up this slide in our calls. The orientation that we take in EP is that all is welcome here, and we're not here to fix anyone. No one's broken. Um, you know, always as well, we want to do our best to have that orientation with ourselves. We can oftentimes try and fight and wrestle with ourselves internally, make parts of us right, make parts of us wrong. But if we could just relax and realize we're a flawed human being here, just having a go of it, then we can relax and we can stop compounding a lot of the suffering that we go through as a human being. Because what we found is, I mean, there's necessary suffering in this experience as a human, but there's also unnecessary suffering, and that is where human beings sit a lot of the time. So, just with embodied processing, our mission is we believe empowering individuals with the understanding and skills to help themselves and others relieve stress and trauma in the body will change the world. This was kind of our mission statement when we started, and now over the years we've seen this come true with people all around the world. The practitioners that we teach, but also the clients that they teach, and the ripple effect. And we're just passionate about getting this education, this understanding, and these tools and frameworks out into the world, because we don't have to look too far online and on news and stuff to see a lot of the unhealthy trauma responses being carried out on a very global and collective level. If you're interested, I'm just going to tell you once again about our practitioner training, which is half price and on sale right now until midnight tonight. We've had a whole bunch of people join over the last few days, and we're very, very excited to connect with you inside the training. The way that we teach the modality of embodied processing, it's fully online. There's theory modules that are worked through in your own time, about 60 odd hours of those. A thriving online student community where we have daily interaction in our private Facebook group, and plus a bunch of calls like this. We have normally between six or seven calls happening every single month, where myself or Matt or Noel or Ben or Angela or Ash are running calls around all the topics that we teach, so we can stay connected and obviously connect with other people as well on the path. And yeah, that's it. If you are interested, please just look up embodied processing on our website. You'll see the URL there, or you can just Google embodied processing to see. Or just if you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask me one-on-one, reply to any of the emails that we've sent over the last few days, and I'll make sure that I get back to all the questions with that. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay. I might just have a look at these comments and questions right now. A lot of people, as always, talking about Sky, your dog there, Matt, as being
Yeah,
an
no,
emotional regulator.
it's always
She pretty much joins us for every single call that we do, so it'd be weird if she wasn't there. Okay, let's have a look here. Yeah, Melissa just posted the link if anyone's interested about embodied processing and joining us. That's sort of our main program that Matt and I run, um, which is obviously the modality that we teach. Cool. And just lots of thank yous and everything. So thank you, everyone. It's been amazing to have you, not just on this call, but those that have joined us for the first 2 days as well. It's awesome. It fills my heart. We had about 200 people on day one, and about 100 yesterday and today. It's just so cool to see people from all around the world who are interested in this work, whether it's for themselves or with clients or both. So please just take what you've learned over the last few days, and teach other people, share your unique medicine with the world, and help us all make this world a better place. So wherever you are in the world, have a beautiful day, beautiful morning, night, whatever time it is, and we'll speak to you soon.
thanks everyone.